Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 4 of our 4-episode series entitled The Nature of Man and Sin. You'll recall the first 2 episodes, we took a look at the nature of man part, where we considered man before original sin itself, and man after original sin. And we got a feel for where sin came from, what are its origins, and why is it that we sin. Last episode, episode 3, we moved into the sin part of this current series, where we talked about, in general, what sin is, and then we looked at the first of those 2 types of sin, mortal sin. And we focused on the conditions or the requirements necessary to commit a mortal sin. And you'll recall that they are grave matter, as specified by the 10 Commandments, full knowledge, and full consent. This episode will move to venial sin. We'll talk about the conditions for committing that and what that is. And then we'll wrap up by talking about punishments for sin. But before we move into venial sin and the punishments for sin in general, I want to mention a few additional things regarding mortal sin that we couldn't quite get to last episode. Okay? And these a few additional sins are under the category of gravity. Remember, we said that the first requirement is grave matter, and there are different degrees of gravity. There's material gravity and moral gravity. As far as gravity is concerned, a couple of other things we might want to consider that factor into determining what degree of mortal sin we've committed, how grave of a mortal sin we've committed. 3 more factors that I want to mention is, number 1, in addition to the amount, like when we remember our example, stealing, in addition to the amount I steal, and in addition to the circumstances surrounding the stealing, in addition to material gravity and moral gravity, there's also a gravity that speaks to who I'm sinning against, okay? In other words, if I'm sinning against a stranger, it would be different than if I'm sinning against, let's say, a family member, let's say my father or from my mother. So using our example of stealing or theft that we established last episode, if I'm stealing, in addition to how much and what the circumstances are, if I'm stealing from a stranger, that's different than if I'm stealing from a family member, okay? Also, another thing that factors into gravity is, in addition to the one I'm sinning against, okay, then what are the situations of the sinner himself? So in other words, who I am, all right, is also going to factor in, okay? Am I, let's say I'm a priest. And again, staying with the sin of theft, of stealing, okay? If I'm a priest doing the stealing, that's going to be different than if I'm just a regular layperson doing a stealing. It's still stealing, it's still sinful. The amount, the material gravity is going to be factored in. The circumstances, the moral gravity are going to be factored in. Who I'm stealing from is going to be factored in. And then who I am, the one doing the stealing, the one committing the sin, that's also going to be factored in, okay? And if I'm a priest, that's going to be looked at differently than if I'm a layperson, okay? Because again, if I'm a priest, using our example, that's going to create more scandal than if I were just kind of a regular layperson, okay? It's still sin, it's still bad, but there's various factors that factor into gravity. So you've got the amount, material, the circumstances, moral, okay? You've got who I'm sinning against and who I am as the sinner himself. So a couple of more factors a couple of more things that factor into gravity that we didn't quite have the time to mention last episode, but I want to kind of put them out in front of you today to indicate that those additional things are factored in to determine the gravity of the sin, the gravity of the mortal sin that you committed. So with that, we'll put our finishing touches on mortal sin, and we'll move to our job this episode, which is to take a look at the other type of sin, venial sin, and then treat this concept of punishment for sin, okay? Now, a venial sin, mortal sin involves grave matter. If the matter is not grave, okay, then you're talking venial sin. Venial sin is still sin, so the overall definition still holds. You're still disobeying God's law, hence disobeying God, okay? You're separating yourself from God. You're separating yourself from a right relationship with God. So it's still sin, but if it's non-grave matter, then it's a venial sin, okay? So grave matter, mortal sin, anything less than that, anything less than grave matter, venial sin. But even venial sin is sin. You're disobeying God's law, you're disobeying God, you're separating yourself from Him, you're no longer in a full right relationship with Him, okay? Now, what are the consequences or the results of venial sin, okay? Because, a lot of us, we say, okay, mortal sin, obviously, that's big time, that's a huge sin, I want to avoid that. But, come on, Charles, venial sins, yeah, they're sins, but they're really not that big of a deal. So I'm not as worried about committing venial sins as I am mortal sins. And, we want to try and not go down that path because, okay, fine, venial sins are sins that don't involve grave matter, okay? The consequences, as we'll talk about in a minute, the consequences are less severe than mortal sin. But two things we got to remember at the end of the day. Venial sins are still sins, and they still do have consequences. Maybe they're not as dire as mortal sin, but there are consequences. And those consequences are in regards to our soul, all right? So we don't want to downplay or poo-poo, so to speak, the importance of venial sins and what they do. Because even though they're not grave matter, even though the consequences are not as dire, at the end of the day, they're still sins. We're still disobeying God's law. We're still disobeying God. We're still fracturing that relationship we have with Him. And they still do have consequences, okay? Because they are still sins. So what are those consequences, all right? Well, going back to mortal sin, we said mortal sin was mortal because it kills sanctifying grace. It drives out sanctifying grace. It drives out those virtues. It totally separates us from God, okay? Mortal sin is spiritual death of the soul, right? Now, venial sin, okay, that doesn't kill sanctifying grace. That doesn't drive out sanctifying grace. It doesn't drive out the virtues. It weakens them. And there's the first difference between the consequences of venial sin and those of mortal sin. Mortal sin drives out sanctifying grace, drives out the virtues. Venial sin doesn't drive them out, it just weakens them. And here's where we can fall into another trap. We can say, well, Charles, okay, well, if it doesn't drive out sanctifying grace, if it doesn't drive out the virtues, if I still have the sanctifying grace, but it's weaker, how big of a deal is that? Okay? Because going back to our analogy of sanctifying grace being our equipment, so to speak, to enter and live in heaven, all right? If I lose it, which I do through mortal sin, I'm not equipped to enter and live in heaven. But venial sin, I don't lose the equipment, okay? The equipment is just weakened. So that doesn't sound like such a big deal, all right? Well, let's stay with our analogy, okay? Let's say I'm going to go to outer space, right? I need the proper equipment, so I don a spacesuit, all right? So I've got the spacesuit, and I hop into that space shuttle, right? And I start going to outer space, right? What I didn't notice in that spacesuit is it had holes in it, small little tears, okay, that allowed the oxygen to leak out. So I still had the spacesuit, but it was compromised. It was weakened, all right? That's kind of the difference between venial sin and mortal sin. Mortal sin, I don't have the spacesuit, so to speak, again. Venial sin, I still have the spacesuit. I still have sanctifying grace, but it's been weakened, all right? And you might say, well, okay, I get the analogy. I get what you're saying, Charles. But the fact that I still have it, yes, it's weakened, but the fact that I still have it, that still doesn't sound like such a big deal to me. Well, the problem with venial sin, beyond the fact it's a sin, right, and it has consequences, is venial sin, yes, sanctifying grace is weakened. I still have it. But since it's weakened, all right, my resistance to temptation is weakened, all right? I leave myself more vulnerable to falling to prey of that temptation. I leave myself more vulnerable to sin, all right? And it's easier now for me to commit more venial sins and more venial sins. And then, things being the way it is with our fallen human nature, maybe now there's an escalation. And now I'm no longer committing venial sins, I'm committing mortal sins, all right, which will kill and drive out sanctifying grace. So venial sins are subtle in that way, in that although they don't drive out sanctifying grace, I still have it. The sanctifying grace is weakened, and with it, my resistance to sin is also weakened, so I'm more compromised, and I'm more able, if you will, to fall into to act on those temptations and to sin, and I'm more compromised and able, if you will, to down the road escalate my sinful behavior. And now I'm not just committing venial sins, now I'm committing mortal sins, which will drive out sanctifying grace, which will keep me from entering and living the life of heaven, okay? Now, we must understand this properly. No amount of mortal sins no amount of venial sins turn into a mortal sin. But venial sins dispose you to committing mortal sins more easily, because your protection against that, so to speak, your sanctifying grace, although you still have it, has been weakened, okay? Also, the other thing that the other thing that venial sins do is, again, because the sanctifying grace is weakened, all right, we're more vulnerable to those temptations like we just mentioned. Also, another thing that comes from the weakening of sanctifying grace in our soul, which is the result of venial sin, is that our fervor for God and the things of God starts to lessen and starts to wane, okay? Our fervor for praying, for maybe going to Mass, for going to confession, for reading the Bible, for reading good Catholic books, for staying away from, movies and things we should stay away for. Our fervor for doing that is also lessened, all right? And with that being lessened, okay, if my taste and my fervor for prayer and Mass and for God and the things of God and reading the Bible, if that's waning, okay, again, that in addition is going to make me more susceptible to falling into sin in the future and eventually escalating my sinful behavior to mortal sin. So venial sin, if we can say this about it, venial sin, it's still sin. It's still disobeying God. It's still, that's a big deal, okay? But venial sin the real trap of it, if you want, is what it compromises in you, okay? It weakens sanctifying grace, so you're more susceptible to sin, and you have less fervor for doing the things that keep sin at bay, all right? So it really, I mean, yes, it's a crack in the door, all right? But then that crack can get wider and wider and wider, and all of a sudden now you're committing more and more venial sins, and now all of a sudden you're escalating to mortal sins, and you wonder, how did I get here? All right? Well, if we rewind the tape, all right, you got there not in one big fell swoop by committing one big mortal sin, but you got there by committing venial sin after venial sin after venial sin, and then all of a sudden now that kind of compounds itself, right? And now all of a sudden you've compromised yourself to such a degree where now it's easier for you to commit mortal sins, okay? And we already talked about what the consequences of those are. So venial sins, even though they involve non-grave matter, and the consequences are not as dire immediately, they can add up, all right? They can lead us. They don't turn into mortal sin, but they can lead us to committing mortal sin where the consequences now are dire. So, you know, to coin a phrase, don't sleep on venial sins, okay? They're still sins, they still have consequences, and those consequences can still build up, and we can still find ourselves falling prey to mortal sin, which has those dire consequences. So that's the difference between mortal sin and venial sin, okay? And that's the difference between the consequences or results. Now, let's move to our final thing we want to consider in this episode and in this series in general, and that is the fact that sin has punishment. Even though in confession the sins are absolved, the sins are forgiven, okay, the punishment for those sins remain. And the question for many of us is, how come? If the sins are forgiven, why isn't the punishment forgiven? Why does God forgive the sins but still allow the punishment to remain? Okay? Because after all, you know, God is love, God is merciful, God is forgiving. Yes, He is all of those, right? And it's based on that, it's based on His mercy and His forgiveness that He does forgive us of our sins. But God is also holy and He's also just. And His holiness and His justice requires Him to punish sin, okay? Because sometimes, you know, we kind of lose track of those two different sides of God, so to speak. You know, yes, God has the attributes of love and mercy. That's what enables Him to forgive sins. But He also has the attributes of holiness and justice. And those attributes require that He punish sin, okay? So for God to be God, He has to be true to all of His attributes. And in forgiving a sin but leaving the punishment, God is true to all of those attributes. He's true to the merciful and love and forgiving attribute in that He forgives the sins. But He's also true to His holiness and His justice attributes by leaving the punishment. Okay? So that's why in confession, the sins are forgiven and the punishment remains, because of those two aspects, if you will, of God and the attributes that those two aspects have. Okay? His forgiveness and mercy, He forgives the sin, but holiness and justice require Him to punish us for that sin. So that's the first thing we can say as far as sin and punishment and why, although the sins are forgiven, the punishment remains. Another way we can look at it is, I'll give you another analogy. And this is a pretty well-known analogy, so I'm sure many of us will have heard it. But even though it's well-known, it applies here. And that is the analogy of the broken window. And this is how this analogy or this example goes. Suppose you have a house and you have a huge picture window in front of your house, right? And I'm throwing a baseball around, right? And I throw the baseball through your window and I break the window, okay? And you come out and you see the broken window, all right? And I say to you, hey, we'll use Simon as an example. Simon, I broke your window, so I'm owning it, and I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? And Simon, being a merciful and forgiving kind of guy, he says, yes, Charles, I forgive you. Let's hit the pause button here. That's the forgiveness of sin aspect in the confessional, right? I acknowledge I've sinned. I go into the confessional. I admit that sin. I ask God for forgiveness. He forgives me, okay? So at this point in our analogy, that's the forgiveness part. Now we move to the punishment part, all right? Because even though I've acknowledged I threw the baseball through his window, even though I acknowledged it broke the window, even though I said I was sorry, even though I asked for forgiveness, even though Simon did forgive me, the fact still remains that window is broken. And Simon has to be made whole. So either I've got to fix the window, or if I don't have the skill to do that, I've got to hire somebody to do it, okay? So even though Simon has forgiven me, okay, the window still is broken. The window still needs to be fixed. I have to do something to make Simon whole, okay? Now let's move that analogy to sin. I've gone into the confessional. I've asked for forgiveness. God has forgiven me. The sin is forgiven, okay? But I still have, because remember what sin is. It's separation from God, right? I still have to reconcile myself to God. I still have to, take steps to kind of repair that relationship like I had to take steps to repair Simon's window, okay? I do that, I take those steps to repair my relationship with God, okay, by working off, so to speak, the punishment. That's why, incidentally, that even in the confessional, even after the priest says the words of absolution, and you know what's coming after that, the priest gives me a penance that I have to go out of the confessional, go into the pew, kneel down, and satisfy the penance. Why does that sacrament include the penance aspect? Because, again, God's holiness and justice requires He punish sin. We have to work off that punishment, and one of the ways we can do that is by doing the penance the priest gives us, okay? There's other ways in addition to doing the penance the priest gives us after we go into the confessional, there's other ways we can work off the punishments that's due to the sins. Even though the sins are forgiven, there's still punishment that we have to work off because of those sins, right? And we can work that punishment off any number of ways. We can do it through your classic 3 Lenten observances, right? Prayer, that works off some punishment. Fasting, that works off punishment. Giving alms, almsgiving, that works off punishment. Performing the spiritual works of mercy, that works off punishment. Performing the corporal works of mercy, that works off punishment. Participating in Mass worthily and reverently, that works off punishment. And if you say, well, Charles, what's the deal about working off punishment? Why do I have to work off punishment? Because again, in order to enter heaven, okay, we have to be free of all mortal sin, we have to be free of all venial sin, and we have to be free from all the punishments due to those sins, all right? We have to be free of all of that. And even though the mortal sins and venial sins are forgiven in confession, the punishment still has to be worked off. And there's two options. Either we work it off here on earth before we die, or if we die, okay, even if we're in a state of grace, okay, even if we have no sin on our soul, if we die and we still have any unworked off punishment, then we've got to work then we've got to be purged of that punishment in purgatory before we can enter heaven, okay? Because if we're going to stand in front of God, if we're going to live the heavenly life, all right, yes, we can't have any mortal sin. We can't have any venial sin, and we can't have any leftover punishment due to those sins. We have to be, our soul, in a manner of speaking, has to be pristine, okay? So the more of those punishments we can work off here on earth, the better it is. But if we still have punishments to work off when we die, okay, that's what purgatory is for, and thank God for that. So purgatory cleanses us of those last remaining punishments that we didn't work off, and now we can enter heaven, okay? So that's the deal with why sin has punishment, because God's holiness and justice requires it. And that's why we have to work off all the punishment before we can get to heaven, because literally our soul has to be pristine. No mortal sin, obviously, we've already talked about that, but also no venial sin and no punishment for sin. Our souls have to be totally clean, totally pristine in order to enter and live the heavenly life. And thank God He gives us a sacrament to be able to get the sins forgiven, all right? And thank goodness we have ways to work off the punishment due to those sins here on earth. And if we don't quite get to all the punishment, thank God again that there's a purgatory which cleanses us of any leftover punishment. So if you look at it, God could not have done more to enable us to live in heaven with Him for eternity, okay? We can get the sins absolved in confession. We can work off the punishment due to those sins through prayer, fasting, almsgiving, corporal works of mercy, spiritual works of mercy, participating in Mass worthily. And if we've still got some leftover punishment, there's purgatory that takes care of that. So if you add up all those things, God couldn't have done more to say, Charles, I really want you in heaven with me for all eternity. And I've done everything I possibly can to make that happen, okay? But at the end of the day, Charles, the ball's in your court. You've got an intellect, you've got a free will, so you can choose, okay? You can choose the path toward me, or you can choose the path away from me, okay? But what we can't say, what Charles can't say is, well, God, you didn't give me every possible opportunity to be with you, okay? If I'm not with you, at the end of my life, all right, if I'm not with God, it's not because of a lack of anything He didn't do. It's because of the choices I made through the exercise of my intellect and my free will. A daunting prospect, and that's why, the question comes up, and it applies here, is, people have a lot of different reasons for denying that there is a God, or if there is a God, not believing in Him, right? And I'm sure you've heard many of them. And one of them is, well, if God is so good and loving and merciful and forgiving and all of that stuff, and notice the terminology here, because words have meaning, why does God send people to hell? And the answer simply is He doesn't. At the end of the day, we send ourselves to hell, if that's where we're going to go, in and through the choices we make. We've just established God wants us in heaven with Him forever. He's given us every available means to accomplish that. So if we find ourselves in hell for all eternity, it's not for a lack of what God didn't do, it's for the choices we made. We send ourselves to hell, okay, through the choices we made, through our intellect and our free will. And God, as we mentioned in the first half of this series, God gave us a free will, and He's a respecter of that free will. He says, Charles, I gave you a free will. You're going to make the choices you make, and I'm going to honor those choices. So if Charles uses his free will to do the things that send him to hell, God is going to honor that. He's going to say, Charles, the choices you made, your free will choices, I'm going to honor those. So in that vein, we send ourselves to hell. God doesn't send us there. God wants us in heaven with Him. He's given us all the possible means, all the possible opportunities, and then the ball is all in our court. Do we use our intellect and our free will for Him or against Him? Okay? So with that, we'll try and kind of wrap up this 4-episode series on the nature of man and sin. And hopefully we walk away from this series with the following things in mind. Number one, we know the nature of man before original sin. We know original sin itself, how it came about. We know the nature of man after original sin. And then we know what sin is. We know the 2 different ways we can commit it, commission and omission. We know the 2 different types, mortal and venial. We know the conditions or the requirements for committing each type. We know the degrees of each type. We know the consequences of each type. And we also know that sin involves punishment because God's holiness and justice require it, but that we can work off that punishment through various means here on earth and in purgatory. So with that, we'll wrap up this episode on the series on the nature of man and sin. Hopefully it's been understandable. Hopefully we've learned quite a few things. And until our next series, which Simon and I know what it's going to be, but we're going to keep it under wraps to kind of tease you a little bit. Until series number 3, take care, God bless. Thank you for watching and listening, and we'll see you for the yet unnamed series number 3. Take care.